Now then, as most of us are eagerly awaiting for that elusive DLC to drop in Elden Ring, and with the date of which being a bit up in the air, most of us are trying to find new and unique ways to play Elden Ring once again in preparation for whenever it does drop. And with the game having hundreds of weapons, spells, and unique items, there's almost an endless possibility to make some insanely fun builds. Well, today I'm going to be showcasing the top 5 best builds that you can use to get back into Elden Ring, have an immense amount of fun, and enjoy the game again as if you were playing it for the very first time. And with that said, let's just jump straight into things. And to kick things off, coming in the number 5 spot is going to be utilizing a Ghost Flame build. And the good thing about this is there is a whole host of different weapons and incantations that you can use for this specific build, whether that be utilizing Health and Steeple, the Godslayer's Greatsword, or even Death's Poker itself, and the latter is a very overpowered weapon, especially if you scale it correctly. In fact, all of the weapons deal an immense amount of damage and then deal the lingering Ghost Flame damage, dealing a certain percentage of the enemy's health over time. The Ghost Flame ability also has Frost build up, so for those of you that are keen on making a Frost build, these weapons are incredibly useful as they'll deal that obviously immense amount of damage when you proc the Frost ability and then continue to deal extra damage per hit once the enemy is frozen as well. You can make a fairly decent build relatively early, as you can get the Death's Poker and the Godslayer sword in Caelid, and then I also typically like to mix in the Black Flame incantation, so if you want to go on and defeat some of the Godskin duos that are in the game, you can pick up incantations such as the Scouring Black Flame and the Black Flame Ritual as well, just keeping with that sort of Black Flame aesthetic that appears with both abilities and still has that proc over time on your enemy's health. Both the Black Flame and the Ghost Flame sort of go hand in hand, so it's a really cool combination to mix into one build. Also, depending on the main weapon that you're using, let's just say you opt to go with the Death's Poker, you can have a really cool Intelligence and Faith build going on, obviously using the incantations, and then that can also allow you to use spells alongside that, because you're mainly going to be focusing into Intelligence, as the Death Poker focuses purely damage wise with Intelligence, at least for the Ash of War that is. So there's all sorts of combinations just simply with this build itself, and they're all very potent and very deadly, which is why it's a perfect way to start off this list. But like I say, that is the starting place for this list, and we're swiftly moving on to the number 4 spot, and with a sort of similar aesthetic but slightly different in terms of the amount of damage and how cool it looks, we're moving on to number 4, which is going to be Destined Death. Now, as I say, it has a very similar aesthetic. Apart from having black flames around you, you will have the really cool red mist around you with the Destined Death instead, trading the Frost ability with a little bit more damage per hit and more damage ticked from your enemy's health. Now, with most Destined Death builds, you can also mimic a really cool boss in this game, Malakev, and ultimately steal his look and his weapon by using Malekev's Black Blade. It's an extremely powerful colossal weapon, so even if you're just heavily into strength at the moment, this is a brilliant way to incorporate Destined Death, as you will have a colossal weapon that is an absolutely power stancing machine, whilst also having the ability to take away 10% of the enemy's health bar, which they can't regenerate back, deal damage over time, whilst doing thousands of damage with the weapon itself. But if you're not into colossal weapons and you're a bit more into sort of like the nimble sort of dexterity kind of build, you can also use things like the Black Knife. This is the weapon used by the Black Knife assassins, and with the Ash of War can also be used to dodge certain attacks. It's essentially the same as jumping if you were to avoid like someone slamming the ground in front of you, or any low sweeping sort of greatsword attacks from bosses like the Noble Apostle or people like Godfrey. When you really master these weapons, you do sort of get that sense of feeling that you're a true sort of assassin, being nimble, quick, avoiding all of these attacks whilst also slicing through the enemies with some heavy hitting attacks yourself. I would say that this build is very similar to the Ghost Flame, but the weapons in this category seem to be dealing a lot more damage and have a lot more benefits when using their Ashes of War, like I say, either dodging attacks with the Black Knife or having a surrounding area effect to get you out of danger if you're being swamped by enemies with Malekev's Black Blade. And it's just a little bit cooler in my opinion, especially going through the gimmick of saying completing the game as Malakev. You can obviously go and buy his armor, use his weapons and incantations to just rinse your enemies' health bars. So if ever you wanted to feel like an absolute boss and possess a boss's true powers, this is definitely the build for you. And of course, moving up the ladder into the number 3 spot, we have got ourselves the Draconic build, or the Dragon Lord build as I like to call it, heavily revolved around the ancient dragon powers that you can collect throughout the lands between. Fun fact, this was actually my number 1 favourite build up until sort of like recent updates, and whenever I was just playing Elden Ring for myself rather than making obviously content for you lot, I would ultimately always fall back on the Cragblade and the Bolt of Gransax, more specifically, just hurling bolts of lightning at my enemies, spearing them between the eyeballs, and then following up with some draconic incantations, again summoning lightning to just bounce off the top of their domes, rinsing pretty much anything that was on my screen. I always liked the gimmick of dealing more damage to dragons than any other enemy in the entire game, as both the Bolt of Gransax and also the Cragblade deal additional damage. I think it's 15% to ancient dragons and then 25% to normal dragons in the game, and that also goes for some incantations as well. But ultimately the point of this build is obviously defeating all of the main remembrance dragons in the game, like Placidusax to obtain like the Cragblade and his specific dragon breath, Placidusax Ruin, defeating Landsax for his glaive, and Fortisax for his lightning spear and death lightning abilities to culminate them all together and utilize the powers of these ancient dragons that have been roaming the lands between for however long, and take all of those tremendous powers for yourself. This of course allows for all sorts of different combat alternatives, whether it's up close and personal, sweeping your enemies away with the glaive or the lightning spears, and if you want to keep your distance and be some sort of ancient dragon archer, you can also use the Bolt of Gransax just to spearhead your enemies with that lightning bolt. Or if you want to become the lightning bolt yourself, of course you can use the Cragblade, which again is also a brilliant weapon for breaking enemy stances. There are just a whole host of reasons as to why you should make a build around this, but I obviously won't go into every single detail as this will probably turn into a 30-minute video. So if you're someone like me and you want to become a draconic overlord possessing all of the ancient dragon's powers in the game, and again obliterating pretty much any enemy with them, then you must definitely give this build a go. But of course, saying all of that and commending that build as much as I have, there are 2 other builds that I consider a little bit more fun, and one of which, ultimately being at the number 2 spot in this video, is going to be the Lord of Flames. Again, throughout the entire game there are multiple weapons that use fire abilities and obviously multiple incantations revolved around fire, but more specifically, just to point out, I would say Taylor builds around either the Magma Blade, which is incredibly and criminally underrated in this game, and then of course the main man itself, the Blasphemous Blade. Mixing this in with incantations such as Flame of the Fell God or even the Fire Giant's Burn O Flame can allow you to do all sorts of different combinations, essentially turning the floor into lava in front of you or sending a wave of volcanic eruption straight for your enemies. These weapons and incantations are obviously brilliant against enemies that are susceptible to fire, which is about 80% of the enemies that you see on your screen. So bar like dragons and then possibly only the Elden Beast and Radagon, fire and flame damage is a really cool friend to have in this game. The other caveat as well, specifically with the Blasphemous Blade, is it's one of the only weapons that actually heals you with either successive attacks of the Ash of War and also killing off the enemies. So if you wanted to say challenge yourself and go through the game without using any Estus flasks, utilizing every enemy that there is in the open world whilst you're traversing through it, that is a brilliant challenge to try and put yourself through if you're struggling with new ways to complete the game. You can also mix that in with other items like talismans and shields that can heal you over time, so that could probably be something that's really interesting to try and do. But then on the flip side with the Magma Blade, if you just wanted to burn everything alive, you can do that with its Magma Ash of War, leaving lava on the floor and just dealing a tremendous amount of damage to pretty much any enemy in the game. And like I say, mix that in with the incantations that I mentioned earlier, you can have some of those charge up, especially the Flame of the Fell God to ultimately follow you into battle and deal additional damage whilst you're wailing on the enemies with the Magma Blades, and just spread the influence of the Volcano Mana upon the rest of the lands between. And yes, I know it's a little bit sadistic watching everything burn, but it is still extremely fun to do. But if you ever do get tired of burning everything to the ground, there is one build that is extremely fun to use, and I highly recommend that you use it almost straight after watching this video, and that number 1 build being none other than the Battle Mage. And yeah, I know, listen, before you get too upset and start writing those comments about how much I'm a noob and how you need to get good if you're only using a Battle Mage build, the reason why everybody uses them is because they're so fun and extremely overpowered to use. Because with these dirty little Battle Mage builds, you can mix in things like the Dark Moon Greatsword, which is possibly one of the best weapons in the entire game, as formerly said by yours truly, and things like the Moon Veil, which again is possibly one of the best weapons in the game, as said by yours truly. But if you don't want to use any of those weapons, you can then also mix in things like the Wing of Astel, which actually, when you use the Nebula's ability, will actually explode multiple times against your enemies rather than things like the Bastard Stars. But more importantly, you can obviously utilize the spells in the game, so things like the Cannon of Hamer or the Gavel of Hamer to do an immense amount of area effect damage, spells like Stars of Ruin to follow your enemies, dealing hundreds of damage in quick succession, the Phalanxes to defend you at any point and stagger your enemies and then smash them at range with Loretta's Mastery. But not only that, especially if you're using the Dark Moon's Greatsword or even the Adula's Moonblade spell, which you can pick up, you will also be doing additional frost damage. And as you can probably tell from the list that we're discussing, frost is becoming a very common part of my builds as of late, because I'm not gonna lie, I slept on frost for quite some time and it is starting to become one of my favourite status effects that you can apply onto your enemies. Obviously bleed will still be king in terms of damage output, but frost also has its abilities, like I said earlier, increasing the amount of damage that your enemies take whilst also slowing them down, making it easier to dodge and just improving the ease of life with most boss fights and just any fight in general, ultimately making it one of the most overpowered aspects in the entire game. Again, as with pretty much any of the builds that we've spoken about, there's obviously a large range of combinations that you can run. If you obviously want to deal with heavy damage, then yes, run things like the Dark Moon Greatsword. But if you want a more sort of like samurai sort of vibe, an ancient warrior that's been possessed by like moonlight powers, you can obviously use things like the Moon Veil. Or if you want to sort of use the powers of the stars, like I say, the Wing of Astel is also a really cool weapon to use. All of them deal thousands and thousands of damage with nearly every hit and break enemy stances incredibly easily, so that is also just another plus on top of what was already a massive plus with just the build itself. Again, much like I said with the Draconic build, I can literally go on for hours and hours as to why you should be using this build right now, but I would be stopping you from using this build right now, so go and use it right now. Yeah, that is essentially the 5 builds that I suggest you guys should be using, especially if you're either coming back to Elden Ring or if you are still playing Elden Ring and haven't used any of these builds. Definitely give these ones a go because they are extremely fun to use, and I highly suggest using them for at least one of your playthroughs. They are more than capable of carrying you through New Game Plus 7, which is the maximum New Game Plus in terms of difficulty that you can go up to. Obviously this video is here just to hopefully spread a few ideas and get you guys enjoying the game once again, because I know it's a little bit frustrating waiting for that DLC to come. We obviously got the teasers at the very beginning of the year, thinking that maybe it'll be released in 2023, but it's obviously not looking likely, and probably going to be either hopefully early or mid 2024 that we actually see the Shadow of the Erdtrees DLC. But in the meantime, whilst we're waiting for that, and like I say, if you're getting back into Elden Ring in preparation, these are some really fun builds to use. Also, I know that there's probably not going to be as many of you watching to the very end, but for those of you that are, thank you very much for getting this far into the video. And if you wouldn't mind me asking, if you happen to like it at any point, if you could drop a like rating down below, that would be greatly appreciated. It lets me know that you enjoy this type of content and you want to see more. I've also got a whole host of other builds that you can use, which actually go into the build specifically, or the stats, the weapon itself. So if you want to stick around for more content like this video and also future builds that we'll be discussing, make sure that you hit that subscribe button, or if you think that you're subscribed, just double check that you are subscribed, because that way, if you are, you will then be up to date with everything that's released on this channel. And of course, the builds that we've discussed about today are mainly subjective because it's what I typically enjoy using, so there might be something on here that you may not like using as much as something else. So if you have got any other suggestions for different builds, feel free to let me know in the comments down below. I'll also try and highlight as many cool builds as I can, but other than that, I think I've taken up more than enough of your time. Thank you all again so much for watching this video. I hope you're all having an amazing day, and I guess I'll catch you in the next video of whatever it is that we make. Bye bye.